In real estate, mastering negotiation is crucial. For buyers, it's about showing financial readiness and making savvy offers. Pre-approval for mortgages demonstrates seriousness, giving buyers an edge in competitive scenarios. The key is to balance realistic offers with the market's pulse, particularly in high-stakes bidding wars. Sellers focus on maximizing value. Strategic pricing attracts serious interest, while staging elevates the property's appeal. Skillfully navigating multiple offers and counteroffers can significantly impact the final deal. Negotiation is more than just numbers. It's about striking a balance where compromise and adaptability lead to beneficial outcomes for both parties. This involves emotional intelligence, understanding market dynamics, and a bit of psychological insight. Real estate agents are instrumental in these negotiations. Their experience and knowledge of legal and ethical standards can transform an average deal into an exceptional one. Whether buying or selling, informed and tactical moves pave the way for successful transactions. So I'm excited to welcome Rich Carey back to Inspired Money. Rich successfully built a real estate portfolio that he managed while stationed in Germany and Korea. He managed to acquire over 20 properties and be debt-free. Today, he's retired from the Air Force and he's living off the passive income generated by his 30-plus properties in Montgomery, Alabama. He's a realtor, he manages his investments, and you can learn about building wealth through real estate on his TikTok and YouTube channels, Rich on Money. Welcome back, Rich.
Hey, how you doing? Sound okay? Am I good?
You sound good. You sound and look good.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, what are key lessons you've learned about negotiating from your real estate investments?
You know, it's interesting. I came from a police background. I actually came from a law enforcement background. And so I sort of had a career of doing, I guess you would say, interviews and interrogations, right? That's a little strange place to start, but interestingly enough, I remember getting in training in something called the Reid method a long time ago. That's actually training that's given to law enforcement. And I remember taking a course in that was several weeks long. So I think one of the most important things, I think it has a lot to do with, first of all, you really have to understand the market. There's always trends in the market as far as whether you've got, whether it's a buyer's market, whether it's a seller's market. And you need to understand those trends. And you need to understand it nationwide. You need to understand it at the state level, the city level, and even at the neighborhood level. And especially I think it has a lot to do with too. I mean, are you talking about an investment property for between $50,000 and $200,000? Are you talking about in Montgomery, Alabama? If you're talking about a property that's, let's say, $400,000 to $700,000, that's considered top of the market, right? When maybe in California, that might be considered very cheap. But you kind of have to understand all those trends first to understand, where do you have strength to negotiate and where do you kind of have to give into market pressures, I think is a starting point.
Brian, in your experience, asking the right questions is really important. Where do you stand on this interrogation?
Asking the right questions, but also understanding the background information. So every negotiation we talked about earlier starts with preparation. So understanding all the dynamics around the situation that you're about to negotiate are also critically important. I own a bunch of real estate as well. I bought probably 10 properties down in Tampa, Florida in the last 18 months. And literally just watching the market and watching valuations fluctuate. And then one of the other critical keys to negotiation, in my point, and I say this in my books, is never get emotionally involved in a deal because there's always another one around the corner. So we'll make multiple offers on real estate, for instance, like what Rich does, knowing that if they don't take it, it's okay. I'll make the same offer to somebody else. And I'll do that 4 or 5 times until somebody says yes. So the negotiation is understanding the market, the dynamics, the people that are in it, how things are working, and then structure your offer, your negotiation around all those points without being emotionally involved. So if you understand there's always a better deal, or there's always another deal down the road, then it's easy to go into the negotiation process and win.
Real estate's unique because oftentimes the buyer and seller are not communicating directly. You have brokers who are the in-betweens. How do you have to handle that differently?
I use the same broker on all of our deals, so she knows my deal. So she knows if I make an offer and they come back and counter it, she already knows what I'm going to say, right? And this is having a good relationship with the people you're working with. One of the first things I said in the podcast today is having a good team of people. My broker here in Atlanta, my broker in Florida, both know what I'm going to do and what I will and won't agree to. So I let them just work their magic. And if they come back and say, hey, the buyer said this, I'm like, well, you know what I'm going to say. And if they don't want the deal, we'll move on to the next one, right? Because it has to be a good deal or we're not going to do it.
I like the takeaway that you have to separate your emotion from the process. Everold, you mentioned that you're negotiating less frequently at a surprising amount on the auto sales. Does your experience in sales and negotiation help you in real estate? Because I know that you've had real estate purchases too.
Yeah, it certainly does. And like Brian is saying, I've actually partnered with a couple of brokers that I know, and we've developed a relationship as well. And they, even though it's not as many properties as these gentlemen are doing, but they know what I'm looking for. They didn't, it's all about time, right? We want to conserve time. We're very busy people, and they do the legwork, and they bring either if it's a good deal, or they bring their recommendations accordingly. And I trust them as well because they've done business with me on the other side. So it's a mutual trust relationship, and I take their advice, but then I'll make the decision based on what I think is right.
Rich, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, your question earlier is an interesting one for real estate, and that is that when you're in a transaction, if you're a real estate agent or the buyer or the seller, you've got to worry about not necessarily dealing with the opposite party. In other words, the buyer doesn't have to worry about negotiating with the seller, but the agents are negotiating with each other, and the buyers and sellers are usually sort of like a telephone game. So I think it's imperative on an agent, right? An agent may himself be a good negotiator, but I think the trick is there's a large variety of real estate agents and their competency and their their responsiveness and their willingness to work with you. You've got to kind of sense quickly in the opposite party that you're dealing with, that other agent, what's their personality like? You've got to be able to connect to them. They've got to like you. They've got to trust you. And it can be tricky at times to know if, the offer you're presenting is being presented correctly to the actual buyer or seller, through the agent. And so sometimes you may sense that message isn't quite getting across, and you've got to find creative, tactful ways to go back to that agent and, ask them in a way that they can respond to, hey, look, did they really think about this aspect of the deal yet?
Yeah, it can be a tricky one. And I don't know if the panel has any input into like strategy. Like, do you ask for the moon? How big an ask are you making when starting a negotiation because you have the brokers often talking to each other? Or are you putting forth something more realistic and reachable?
I'll jump in on that one. And the example I always use, and I love this one, y'all know who Richard Branson is, right?
Yep.
He wrote a book called Screw It, Just Do It years ago. And one of the things that he said in his book, and he was talking about his acquisition of Necker Island, and they were asking $8 million for the island. He offered him $100,000, right? It was a ridiculous offer. He got it for 180, right? So one of the things he says in his book, and I've had people, by the way, in podcasts say, well, that's just mean to do that. But one of the things he said is, if your first offer doesn't insult them, you offered too much. But what we're really doing in that lowball offer is trying to set an anchor of the bottom, right? So if you're asking 100 and I offer you 90, 90 is the anchor. We're going to settle between 90 and 100. If you're offering 100 and I offer you 70, I've anchored at 70. Now we're gonna figure. I might still come in at 95, but I don't know that if I offered you 95. I only know that if I've offered you 70, and we start working our way back up to what's actually going to go through. So negotiation is a big old game between the two people, and we don't know where the other party is until we start the game. And I always start the game with a low anchor.
Yeah. If I could add on to that real quick. I think that it's always going to, for me, it's always going to be situationally dependent. And I can think of two very different scenarios. Me trying to buy a distressed property for the cheapest price that I can, personally. And then me as a listing agent trying to negotiate an offer on an expensive property where there's a lot of interest from many parties. So recently, I can think of two different occasions where I was nervous about how low I was going in trying to buy this investment property for a rock bottom price. I think I offered like, $30,000 for a townhouse. And I'm like, geez, I'm embarrassing this guy. And he took it so fast that I realized I realized I'd made a huge mistake. And if your offer gets accepted happily, you've made a huge mistake. And I just did the same thing on a much larger home that I'm probably going to do a live-in flip on. It's like 4,000 square feet, beautiful house. And I offered probably like half what it's worth. And again, the guy just jumped in so fast and took it. It's like, geez, I didn't have the guts to go lower, but I just left a lot of money on the table.
Have you guys ever heard of the winner's curse?
Yeah.
The winner's curse says if you win, you paid the most that anybody else on planet Earth would pay. Right? And they jumped on it.
And I think the thing that I would add to that, though, is in a scenario where it's a competitive property, right? When you ask for the moon, you get ignored and it gets, sold to somebody else. And, then you're out and maybe it's hard to find a similar property. So there's always going to be that part to consider, too. If you found this person off market and they're not dealing with anybody else, you can go pretty low. If this property's on the MLS and there's lots of interest in it, you can't go too low because they may have cash offers over asking. So you kind of have to kind of know the market. You have to know what's going on.
Yeah. So it depends. All right, let's move to the next segment.